But Charles Worcester, the chief scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund, put it pretty well. Since you already know the other parts, what he said was, if the environmentalists win on DDT, they will achieve a level of authority they have never had before. In a sense, then, much more is at stake than DDT. That was a statement in 1969. And I think that pretty well sums up their trying to get more power. But on the other hand, the general public reads all about the thin eggshells and the birds that were dropping out of the sky dead and all the other awful things. And I wish I had time to talk about all those. I'd be delighted to do it. But I'll try to summarize some of the other things. How valuable is DDT? The National Academy of Sciences, pretty good quote, to only a few chemicals does man owe as great a debt as to DDT. In little more than 2 decades, DDT has prevented 500 million human deaths due to malaria that would otherwise have been inevitable. That sounds great, but not everybody appreciated that. Too many people mean difficulties. Going back to Charles Worcester again, the chief scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund, I'll refer to as EDF from here on. He was referred to by Victor Yanukovych, one of the 3 founders of the EDF. In a speech Yanukovych made in New York, he talked about a reporter asking Dr. Worcester if DDT wouldn't result in a greater use of much more toxic pesticides with a long record of killing people. And Worcester said, so what? People are the cause of all of our problems. We have too many of them. We need to get rid of some of them, and this is as good a way as any. He was thinking about the people being killed by malaria, yellow fever, typhus, plague, and all those other things that insects cause. Then they said, but how do you square the killing of people with the mere loss of some birds, primarily pelicans at that time? And Worcester replied, quote, it doesn't really make a lot of difference because the organophosphate acts locally and only kills farm workers. And most of them are Mexicans and Negroes. Well, Congressman De La Garza was there. He was outraged at this. He wanted to force Worcester to come and testify, and Worcester refused to do it. Worcester wouldn't even testify in the EPA hearings that lasted for 7 months. But we also had the Audubon Society. I should say I'm a member of the Audubon Society. I always have been, and published articles in Audubon magazine. And I've been a member of the Sierra Club for a long time. Dave Brower was my commanding officer in the Army in assault climbing school in West Virginia. But we disagree about DDT, of course. But the Sierra Club has changed considerably lately, too. But the Audubon Society distributed 17,000 little leaflets with the message, DDT should be banned throughout the land and banned from export. And I thought, well, they succeeded eventually, of course. The Sierra Club Executive Director, Mike McCloskey, quote, the Sierra Club wants a ban on persistent pesticides, even in the tropical countries where DDT has kept malaria under control. End of quote. I thought that indicated that at least he knows what he's talking about, that malaria is a good regulation of population, and if you can get rid of DDT, you have more people die of malaria and less population problem. Sierra Club has changed quite a bit since, by the way, I did write the Climber's Guide to Glacier National Park, and the Sierra Club published it. It's in its 5th edition now. But so I have nothing against the Sierra Club as it used to be. It's changed quite a bit. Right now, the 5th officer, then you've got a president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and David Foreman is the next highest officer in the Sierra Club. You may have heard of him. He wrote the book called The Field Guide to Monkey Wrenching, How to Destroy Equipment, How to Move Survey Lines, and all kinds of things you can do to prevent people from progressing. His statement was, we must tear down existing dams, free the shackled rivers, reclaim the roads and the plowed land, and return to wilderness tens of millions of acres of presently settled land. It bothers me to have somebody like that at the top of the Sierra Club. It's not the same Sierra Club that we used to enjoy so much. We also have Jacques Cousteau, who's very well known, and I can't explain his statement, but he says, in order to stabilize world population, we need to eliminate 350,000 people every day. He said, it's a terrible thing to say, but it's just as bad not to say it. So you can see why not everybody agrees it's a great thing to control malaria and all the other diseases that are so important. But the greatest threat to servicemen in Europe in 1943 or 44 was typhus. As I said a while ago, typhus killed 6 million people in the First World War, getting a pretty good start in the Second World War. Just in time they developed DDT. Air freighted it over to Italy, put an end immediately to the typhus epidemic. My first exposure to DDT was in 1944. I was dusting people with DDT in Europe. I didn't know what it was all about. I was a specialist in beetles, not pesticides, but I was impressed that people walk so far with their families just to have some DDT dusted down the front, down the back, and in the hair. And of course, nobody took any baths or showers for weeks at the time. So it stopped the body lice from transmitting typhus, one of the big killers of mankind. The other thing that it's good against is yellow fever. Yellow fever is most famous because of the Panama Canal, where 20,000 people died working on the canal. Eventually, Walter Reed and his colleagues determined how it was transferred. They even got to end the epidemic by controlling the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes that had been introduced down there. Going way back, I've always said that Napoleon Bonaparte keeps losing his armies because of pesticides not being available. This case, yellow fever, Bonaparte was investigating the Mississippi River, lower end of it, and he lost 30,000 of his men to yellow fever at that time. We withdrew from the United States, which was not called that at the time. The French didn't want England to have that area, so they sold it to the United States at a cheap price in the Louisiana Purchase. So again, pesticides have changed the course of the world. Plague bacilli, the Black Death, bubonic plague and pneumonic plague destroyed a fourth of the population of Europe in one big epidemic in the 14th century, and 2/3 of the population of the British Isles were killed by plague at that time, transmitted by fleas. Trying to save time here, we're running a little bit short, as you know. But malaria is the major thing that DDT has been responsible for controlling, and transmitted by primarily Anopheles mosquito. And a couple of outstanding examples. India had 70 million cases of malaria every year, and then they sprayed DDT for 3 years. And at the end of that, instead of 70 million, they had 150,000 cases and only 1,500 deaths. Other details I'll spare you here, but well, I should mention Ceylon, Sri Lanka, where they had about 2 million cases of malaria every year. And at the end of the DDT spray program, they had only 17 cases in the entire country. So they stopped spraying too soon, and it built back up to more than 1 million cases. World Health Organization, realizing people were getting opposed to DDT for various reasons, they tested 1,300 other insecticides trying to find a substitute that would do as good a job controlling malaria. They spray it on the inside of the walls of the houses. Then when the mosquitoes bite the people, land on the walls, and they die of the poisoning by DDT. If they don't die, of course, they can transfer the disease to the next person they feed upon. But these 1,300 possible substitutes, they found 3 that were possible out of 1,300. And these 3 were not nearly as good because they're too expensive. It cost, in 1972, the World Health Organization paid $70,000 for the DDT to control malaria. Runs to about 20 cents per person to save a life for a year. If they had used malathion instead of DDT, instead of $70,000, they would have spent $370,000. And the other substitute that was pretty good was carbaryl, also known as 7. And carbaryl, replacing DDT, would have cost $1,300,000. These countries that don't have very much money can't afford even DDT, so it was impossible to put a substitute in. We had, I got a lot of things that say omit, it's probably a good thing, but the biological magnification is one thing you keep hearing about, and wish I could spend an hour on that too. A lot of facts and figures would be interesting, at least to me. But biological magnification simply doesn't exist if you do the way that normally you would think about. But what they do is analyze the DDT in the water, and they see how many million times it's magnified when it gets into the crustaceans in the bottom of the pond. And then the things that eat the crustaceans, let's say the fish, will have a higher level of DDT than the crustaceans. And then the ducks that eat the fish would have a higher level than that. And finally the hawks that eat the ducks would have it even higher. If you simply measured the muscles in all these cases, you would not have the biological magnification. But what they do is measure the wet weight of the crustaceans, the dry weight of the fish, and then they compare the dry weight of the fish with the lipid tissues in the duck. And each time they call it biological magnification. Then they measure the brain tissue in the raptor, at top of the food chain. Again, they have more magnification. If you measure the muscles in every one of those instances, you would not have any biological magnification. In fact, you have a decrease in the food chain in many cases. And I always like the when they're feeding dieldrin to thrushes. The dieldrin was in the soil. The earthworms are very rich in dieldrin, but not as much as the soil had. And the birds that ate the worms didn't have as much concentration of DDT as the worms did. So biomagnification sounded good, improved on a lot of people's minds, but it simply didn't work. I was expecting, I wrote 2 articles on this, I was expecting a lot of opposition from the environmentalists. To my surprise, they never said a word, they just stopped using it. So I guess they know all the time that it was not really a legitimate thing. But biomagnification is interesting, and I'll skip on to something else. Rachel Carson, you've heard of her, she wrote a book called Silent Spring, and I must admit, having been in the Nature Study Club of Indiana and a lot of other organizations, I always thought I was an environmentalist, and I thought she was too. So I was all on her side when I was reading the book in 1962. But as I read, I realized several things that were not true, but you kind of pass it over if your friend says it. And even when she said, one of the cases, she said that few of the eggs hatched in the work done by DeWitt. And when I read the article, which was not easy to get, I found that 83% of the controls hatched their eggs, and only 80% of the ones fed DDT had eggs hatch. This is a very high magnification of DDT anyway. And I still thought maybe she said fewer instead of few, because I didn't think few of the eggs would be 80%. That's quite a lot of eggs to hatch. But that was my first real clue, and as I read further, it got worse and worse. And I finally turned on the other side, decided that Rachel Carson was in it for the money. But she dedicated a book, the very first page, dedicated to Albert Schweitzer, the famous African doctor. She says, Albert Schweitzer said, "Man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. You'll end by destroying the earth," unquote. She knew he was talking about atomic power, but she made it sound like he was talking about DDT. So I went and got Schweitzer's autobiography. On page 262, he tells what he thinks about DDT. He says, "How much labor and wasted time these wicked insects do cause us, but a ray of hope in the use of DDT is now held out to us." So that was the first page in Rachel Carson's book. And it goes on. She also wrote, she said, "Like the robin, another American bird, the bald eagle, seems to be on the verge of extinction." That was 1962 when she was writing this. Roger Tory Peterson, the best ornithologist in the United States, probably in the world, wrote the same year, 1962, he said, "What is the most abundant bird in North America? The robin." The one that Rachel Carson just said is on the verge of extinction. So it was things like that all the way through the book that impressed me so much. I eventually began to study this as a hobby. I've never taught a course in it, but just keeping the details have been interesting. And naturally, I'm not very much impressed with Rachel Carson's book in other ways either. In fact, a leading British scientist said in his inaugural address, if there had been a worldwide ban on DDT, as Rachel Carson wanted, then Rachel Carson and her book would now be killing more people in a single year than Hitler killed in his entire Holocaust. And unquote. Perhaps that was not her intent, but the results were about the same. Now, millions of people died then. Let's see, for years we read newspapers and magazines that DDT was killing off the birds. But I've been on the autumn and Christmas bird counts myself a few times. And I have here the complete list of bird counts from 1941 to 1960. And the total number of birds seen has not been going down, it was going up. And the ratio per observer is also on the list. You've probably all seen a similar list. They don't do it this way anymore in the Audubon Society. I think, well, as a matter of fact, they were very unhappy that we were quoting these things. Tom Jukes and Robert White Stevens and a bunch of us. So they published the article in the New York Times saying that we were paid by the pesticide industry to lie about the Christmas bird counts, showing more birds instead of fewer birds. I thought it was pretty bad, but I couldn't do much about it. However, the 5 names mentioned, myself and Tom Jukes and Robert White Stevens and Norman Borlaug and Donald Spencer, and they're much higher personalities. I was up in the national park climbing mountains feeling bad about it. They said, how about you want to join our libel suit against the Audubon Society in the New York Times? And of course I did, and we did win the libel suit in New York City in the federal court. They haven't mentioned it since that time. They did have we only won $20,000 apiece, and they had it overturned by a friend of the publishers of the New York Times, a fellow named Kaufman, who sentenced the Rosenbergs to death. You probably heard of Kaufman before. Anyway, getting on to something else. How many birds are there? Let's see, what will I leave out here? Herring gulls, interesting example I thought, in Massachusetts, increased from 2,000 pairs in 1941 before DDT to over 35,000 pairs in 1971 after 16 years of heavy DDT use. They run the state's protected list, but the Department of Natural Resources granted permission for the Audubon Society to poison 30,000 of them on Turn Island. And so they weren't too concerned, I guess, that the Audubon Society wanted to do it. The Audubon leader, William Drury, said it's kind of like weeding a garden, unquote. Now, they got rid of a lot of gulls that way. But the question is, how did the gulls become so abundant during all the DDT years? Obviously, it wasn't causing any harm. Then we have the fish-eating birds. They used to say that the birds eat the fish, therefore the birds pick up the DDT. Fish-eating birds were increasing also. On Funk Island, the gannets increased from 200 pairs before DDT to 3,000 pairs by 1970, just before DDT was banned in 1972. Murres increased from 15,000 pairs in 1945 to 1.5 million pairs in 1969. So again and again we see the same thing. The Audubon Society then financed the establishment of the Environmental Defense Fund. The EDF then could lobby for Audubon propaganda issues without endangering the Society's tax-exempt status. The founder of the EDF, Victor Yannicone, he was paid $60,000 a year, plus incidental expenses. And I began to realize that he was not too much on their side when he quoted Charles Worcester's statements. But when we were doing our libel trial in New York City, Yannicone called and asked if he could come and testify on our behalf. Didn't know if we should trust him or not. We did, and he testified that he was in the Audubon Society office when they were debating what to do about these people saying there are more birds instead of fewer birds, and decided they would smear our name by saying that we were paid by the pesticide industry. And well, fortunately we won that one. Then we have the leading scientist in the EDF, Charles Worcester. You've heard of before here. Yannicone told Worcester that Worcester should publish something biological. Worcester was listed in the American Men of Science. His specialty was jet fuel luminosity instead of biology. But so he got some algae and put them in a tank of salt water and added DDT. And then he said it inhibited photosynthesis, which was a concern. I noticed, this is in Science magazine, I noticed that he had the concentration of DDT was 500 parts per million. And that was interesting because DDT does not go into solution except when you get down to 1.2 parts per billion. But he explained it right there in the article, if anybody wants to read it. It says, to each flask of DDT, ethanol was added in order to obtain the desired concentrations. And I had students writing letters to the editor about how you're going to get that much ethanol in the ocean. And anyway, that's Paul Ehrlich, who, by the way, I've known since 1945, and I think we're still friends, but we disagree about this. But Ehrlich reported on Worcester's work saying that the oceans, this was a scenario he wrote in Ramparts magazine. The title was Eco-Catastrophe. And just a couple of lines, he said, Worcester's report smacked of doomsday for all life in the sea, depends on photosynthesis. And DDT has polluted the entire surface of the earth, including the seas. Well, that, the same article, by the way, Eco-Catastrophe, was published in England in this publication, the year's best science fiction. So, I always needle Ehrlich about that every time I see him. But anyway, we have the propaganda going on and on. Let's see. I might add this. I hate to take too much time. I got omits all the way through here. But Worcester's talk about the DDT. Reliable estimates have indicated now if we were to dump into the ocean the total amount of DDT manufactured every year, and if none of it disappeared, it would take 9,000 years to reach a concentration of 1 part per billion in the seawater. And of course, it breaks down rapidly. The EPA's own research at Gulf Breeze, Florida, showed that 92% of the DDT in saltwater disappears in 38 days. And along with the DDT, in fact, I have the official graph here, which you can't see, but the decline here is DDT disappearance. This is DDE appearance and disappearance, and DDD, because these all break down from DDT. So with that kind of evidence, we can't say that DDT is going to last very long in the ocean. In fact, many committees have studied it and came to the same conclusion. It does not persist in seawater, does not build up in food chains, and but you never hear this in the news media. The news media seem to be peculiarly on the other side. You probably have noticed this. Ben Bradley, a Washington Post editor, said, quote, "I'm no longer interested in news, I'm interested in causes. We do not pretend to print the truth in the Post. We print what people tell us. It's up to the public to decide what's true." And the public, unfortunately, is reading Audubon magazine and the Sierra Club Bulletin. Charles Alexander, the science editor at Time magazine, says, "I would freely admit that on the environment we have crossed the border from news reporting to advocacy." And Paul Watson, who, by the way, I hear is in jail now over in Holland, but Paul Watson, the founder of the Sea Shepherd, co-founder of Greenpeace, they get donations of $40 million every year, so they're doing all right. But he said, quote, "It doesn't matter what is true, it only matters what people believe is true," which I think is well stated. And Stephen Schneider, who in the middle of the 70s was talking about global cooling, going to destroy the world by getting colder all the time, he's now the head of the global warming routine up at Stanford University. And Schneider said, you probably have all heard this quote, but I like to repeat it, that Discover magazine, October 1987, "We have to offer up scary scenarios and make dramatic statements and make little mention of doubts. Each of us has to decide what is the right balance between being effective and being truthful," unquote. I guess he decided already. I have here a picture of a zucchini. I forget who sent me this, but it was published in the New York Times by the Environmental Research Foundation. And the little heading here says, "Recently Congress banned the sale of assault rifles. However, it is still perfectly legal to kill someone with a zucchini." Well, and the little print tells what they're talking about. He says it's perfectly legal to kill someone with a zucchini, and each year thousands of men, women, and children die from cancer caused by toxic pesticides on fruits and vegetables. I was bothered by that to the extent where I wrote a response, sent it to the New York Times. They didn't answer as usual, but the American Council on Science and Health thought it was good. They published it in Priorities magazine, and so you can't get in the news media very well. I keep thinking someday maybe they'll turn around and begin to say, that's a pretty good story about so-and-so lying about what he fed the birds. And that would be, they'd have an unlimited supply of things they could publish. It would be interesting to the public. Not too good for science, unfortunately. Getting back to cancer, the Montrose Chemical Company in California manufactures DDT, or before they went out of business. And will you give me a 5-minute warning when I'm almost through?
Yes, 30 minutes.
Just, oh, that's good. I can go on and on. Because I do teach entomology, and we have a lot of entomological sayings. And one of these is, time flies like the wind, house flies like manure. To get back to the subject, Dr. Laws, Ed Laws, studied the workers at Montrose Chemical Company. And the 35 of the workers most heavily exposed, they're dealing all day long with their bare hands and inhaling the dust. They absorbed up to 600 times more DDT than the average human. And this went on for 9 to 19 years, depending on the worker. And no worker in the plant ever developed cancer during 19 years of continuous exposure to 17 milligrams per man per day. And Dr. Laws was so impressed with that, he did experiments with mice, DDT-fed mice compared with non-DDT-fed mice. Then he injected into the brain cancer cells, and he found that a lot of the mice that were on DDT diet rejected the cancer. This has been done over and over in other experiments also. McLean described the reduction of cancer in test rodents on DDT diets, and OK and Life Sciences magazine. Mammary tumors induced by anthracene were inhibited by DDT in the diet. 72% of the controls got tumors, but only 36% of the DDT dosed rats did. And Selinskas and Oki and National Cancer Institute journal, DDT significantly reduced the percentage of rats with tumors and the number of tumors per rat. And Wayland Hayes did the biggest study with prisoners in Georgia, feeding them doses of 3.5 to 35 milligrams of DDT per day. 35 milligrams of DDT per day is a high dose. A normal person in the United States is taking about 13 milligrams a year. So 35 milligrams a day you might think would cause some effect. But for 21 months, they ate this amount every day, developed no adverse effects. And partly because of that, and because I had so many people who were still worried about DDT, I began to, one day in class, I had the DDT box on my desk for some reason. One of the students was leaning back from it. I said, "What's the trouble?" And he said, "The box is open." I said, "Well, it's not poisonous to people." I dumped out my hand and ate a batch of it. And pretty soon the school paper came over and asked if I would eat some more DDT so they could take pictures of it. I almost emptied the box. No, really, about 3 times I'd take another bite and they'd take another picture. I really began to think maybe I began to feel jittery or something. That's an awful lot of DDT to be taken all of a sudden. But it went over so well that I began to give, each time I give a talk, I'd take a tablespoonful of DDT and eat it, and wash it down, and it got the crowd's attention. And then I got a phone call from Esquire magazine, got the cover here, wanted to know if I could get a picture of me eating DDT. And they published it. Now here's Angela Davis' picture here, and here's George Wald, the Nobel Prize winner, down here, and well, anyway, there's my picture. And I was pleased. All he said was that I said it tasted like talcum, and I was eating it in an effort to show it's not as bad as people think. So that's the only time I've ever had my picture in Esquire magazine. I got a lot of letters, by the way, including, did I have that one? Yeah, I'll probably never find it. Anyway, I didn't know how many of my friends read Esquire magazine, but a lot of them did. Well, I can't find the actual quote here, but what it said, this a biology teacher said, if DDT is not poisonous, how do you explain the disappearance of the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon? And I thought that's the kind of mentality I wouldn't want in my biology class anyway. But now we get to the bird situation. I was an ornithologist for 5 years before I was anything else, and then I became a botanist because I didn't think I could ever make any money studying birds. This is before the Endangered Species Act came up. And, so I was majored in botany, and I liked it very much, especially the identification of trees and flowers. And but I couldn't see much future of that either, except for tree surgery and landscape gardening, which would be nice. But I discovered entomology and realized that entomology would go into forest entomology or agricultural or biological control of pests, which I also teach that, or into medical entomology, or into museum work. A lot of opportunities. And I've had almost 80 students now who have developed PhDs in entomology. They're all working. So it's a pleasure. I'm glad I made the change to entomology anyway. My specialty is still beetles. Now, but birds are my first interest. So, and by the way, when I came back from the Army and went to Ohio State, they were so glad to have people. This was November, and I missed the first month or so of school, and they didn't even ask for a transcript. They just took me right in. Fortunately, my transcript was not good at all. But so while I was at Ohio State, they needed somebody to teach ornithology. Even though I never had a course in ornithology, I was teaching ornithology at Ohio State while I was a graduate student. And so I like birds. But the brown pelicans were always interesting. In 1918, people began to worry about the pelicans eating too many birds. So T. Gilbert Pearson and Robert Allen were financed when they made a survey, government survey, the entire Gulf Coast, 1,500 miles. And they found after a year of study that the number would not exceed 65,000 birds. Now in 1934, Robert Allen repeated the survey. By this time he was the head of the Audubon Society. And he found only 900 pelicans on the Texas coast. Hawk magazine, he was talking about over 80% of the entire Gulf population of pelicans had disappeared by 1934. And it continues like that. Had a big freeze in 1936, wiped out a lot of them. They continued to decline. The total number didn't exceed 300 pelicans along the entire Texas coast in 1942, according to the Audubon Society. And that was before any DDT had been used there, of course. And since usually you figure that causes have to precede the effects, I'd like to say that pelicans did not decline in anticipation of DDT. They could have. Thank you. Early 1970s, the Fish and Wildlife Service, very much opposed to DDT, they were issuing bulletins and giving speeches in which they stated, quote, 50,000 brown pelicans have disappeared from the Texas and Louisiana coast since 1961, unquote. The reason was the presence of DDT. On March 18th, I testified 3 times back there before committees on agriculture. Congressman Pogue had a committee, and I gave details of the great declines of pelicans from 1918 to the present time. And he was impressed. The total number of 500 pelicans counted in Texas and Louisiana was so far short of the figure 50,000 that the Fish and Wildlife Service was saying. So I called Finley, the head of the Pelican Project for the federal government, asked him to explain how they could go from 50 pelicans to 50,000 in that short a time. He said, in reply to your telephone inquiry, I've investigated the source of the reported 50,000 brown pelicans. Although reports are sketchy, numbers vary at any one time. Jim Keith, that was his boss, Jim Keith and I both feel the estimate of 50,000 is not unreasonably high. Well, 3 months later, he wrote a letter to Congressman Pogue, 2nd of August, stating the year 1961 was merely a hasty approximation of an unknown time. After reviewing the evidence, I now think I should have said they disappeared by 1961 rather than since 1961. Well, I immediately, of course, said, how can they disappear by 1961? During all those DDT years, they increased from 500 to 50,000 during all the DDT years. And he never answered that letter. But I don't know how they could ever reconcile that with their insistence that DDT was destroying pelicans. I had a lot of questions for the Fish and Wildlife Service, which I can skip here. But anyway, California had a brown pelican problem also on Anacapa Island. And one of my students worked out there as a ranger for 3 years, trying to give people the facts. The superintendent was very much on our side. But a few environmentalists kept going out and saying that pelicans were disappearing. Now, the 28th of January 1969, the Santa Barbara oil spill occurred and surrounded Anacapa Island with oil. The oil had 21 parts per million mercury, and we thought this might have something to do with the pelicans having trouble that year. But to make it even worse, the fish and wildlife biologists went out and they said they collected 72% of all the intact eggs in the colony. Their plan was, of course, to prove that DDT was wiping out the pelican colony. And that's not pelican falcons. Okay. Okay. So my complaint was they didn't inform the public that there's 21 parts per million of mercury in the water surrounding the island. They also didn't explain that the pelicans had no trouble at all during the previous years. Right up to 1968, they were doing well. 1969, the oil fell, and all of a sudden the pelicans were not thriving well on Anacapa Island. They also shotgunned the females in the nest in the colony to get the adults and their eggs to compare the DDT content of both. And there are also Norway rats on the island. We trapped Norway rats right in the pelican nests on Anacapa. Then they landed in helicopters right at the edge of the colony during breeding season. Dawson, his Birds of California, said if you even approach the island one person, they'll desert their colony. So they were landing by helicopter and sitting in the empty nest in the middle of the colony and writing reports about how the bird seemed irresolute. They were flying away and not returning. And the gulls were coming in and eating their eggs. So it was a horrible propaganda by the State Fish and Wildlife Service and the federal government. But they also they insisted that was the only colony in California. I chartered a plane with 2 other professors and we flew around the islands and we found another colony on Santa Cruz Island, which to about 10 miles away, I guess. And also a big colony on San Nicolas Island, the furthest out island off our coast. So I thought they should be telling the people all these things instead of just trying to ban DDT. But they succeeded and I failed. So, but about the oil, Robert Finley, the same guy that said since 1961 and changed it to by 1961, he said there's not a shred of evidence, this is from another letter he wrote to Congressman Pogue, there's not a shred of evidence that spilled oil is capable of causing thin-shelled eggs or otherwise affecting bird reproduction. So I immediately sent back the Journal of Wildlife Management report, oil in eggs reduces hatchability by 68%. And the National Wildlife Federation said oil in the parent's feathers causes embryo mortality. And the Bulletin of Environmental Contamination Toxicology said oil is the cause of pelican mortality for 6 weeks after a spill. And on. Let's see, birds ingesting oil produce 70 to 100% fewer eggs than normal. And liver and spleen atrophy results from oil exposure. And the North American Wildlife Natural Resources Conference said oil causes kidney nephrosis, pancreatic degeneration, and lipid pneumonia. My question was, doesn't the Fish and Wildlife have any library? I guess not. We come to the peregrine falcons, and the environmentalists like to take things that aren't well known. Whoever saw a peregrine falcon before? Not very many people, but they became very famous. In 1913, Dr. William Hornaday, the head of the New York Zoological Society, in his publication Our Vanishing Wildlife, he said peregrines were undesirable and, quote, deserved death, but are so rare that we need not take them into account. He urged anybody who found a peregrine nest to, quote, shoot the parents and destroy the eggs or young, unquote. Now that was long before the millions of dollars were available to artificially rear peregrine falcons. But they collected a lot of the eggs. So the falcons were, as the head of Tom Cade, the head of the Peregrine Fund, who did all the rearing, he says the fund has not been able to replenish the subspecies that lived in the East. It is probably extinct. So instead of replacing the one that was already there, they brought in peregrines from Mexico and Canada and Europe, raised them in captivity, and released over 4,000 foreign peregrines in the United States. The cost, according to Brian Walton, who's in charge of the fund on the West Coast, the cost is $1,500 to $2,000 for each peregrine produced. So a lot of money. And then the fund's director was complaining in 1985, they're having trouble raising funds because 50 million people are starving in Ethiopia. And the Peregrine Fund needs $1 million a year for a peregrine recovery program. And then Frank Beebe, the leading authority in peregrines in North America, up in Canada, he said in his 1971 book, quote, it appears that the Canadian Arctic peregrines, not knowing how gravely ill they are, go right on reproducing in blissful unconcern of their desperate plight. Pretty well put. Well, as far as the bald eagle situation, another one of my favorite topics, of course. Bald eagles have no problem, but ospreys are not as common. But J.J. Hickey wrote the book, The Guide to Bird Watching. He's been a great opponent of DDT at Wisconsin. He attributed a 70% decline of eastern peregrines, eastern ospreys, to pole trapping around fish hatcheries. And that was before DDT was used in the United States. And I was a member of the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary Association, so I got all the counts of Hawk Mountain migrations of birds. Have here the total count from 1946 on, all the different kinds of predators, raptors that migrate across Hawk Mountain. I was especially interested in ospreys, because the number of ospreys migrating went up from 100 and something to 200 to 300. These are all during the DDT years. Up to 400, and finally up to 1969, 527, 1970, 600, 1971, 630, and then they banned DDT in 1972. 1974, the number from 630 went down to 318, next year down to 279. And the people at the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary were concerned about this. If I can find his exact statement here in the Sanctuary newsletter, 1976. For reasons we do not understand at all, the number of osprey going south is returning to something like normal. Not up 600 anymore, it's dropped down to 200 now. That's their normal amount. So during the DDT years, it went 3 times normal. Then got the eggshells. I'm watching. A lot of story about eggshell thinning. The San Francisco Chronicle, 14th of February 1969. Because of DDT, the bird eggshells becoming so thick the young could not get out of the shells. 1 month later, 16th of April, same paper. Because of DDT, the bird eggshells becoming so thin they would break under the weight of the incubating female. Neither of these was true. And Dr. Thomas Jukes said DDT just can't win in the pages of the Chronicle. And it's still true. Well, any shell thinning was said to be a result of pesticides. But then it's easy to test. Do a legitimate experiment. Feed the birds DDT and see what happens. Every time they've done that, they haven't had any bad effects. Except if they did something else. If they cut the calcium. You don't hear a loud sound all the time? Is it too bad? Is it better over here? Hey, can you still hear me? No problem, I'll stand over here. I thought maybe I was the only one. Okay, Bittman at Patuxent, Maryland, government laboratory. Bittman and his Fish and Wildlife Service friends, 69 and 70, fed quail diets with only 0.5% calcium. You should have at least 2.5% calcium to have a healthy bird with healthy eggshells produced. They gave them 0.5% calcium. And they also fed them 200 parts per million of DDT. And that's 4,000 times the amount that people would be taking during the DDT years. Then in the Science article, Science magazine, they claimed that the DDT had caused the shell thinning. Well, I testified again, and that was my favorite topic at that time was Bittman and his eggshell test. And the result of this, well, first I got to tell you that Tucker and Hagel, Fish and Wildlife Service in Denver, fed 3 different calcium levels to 3 different cages of quail. The controls got 3% calcium, the second group got 1.7%, and the third group got 1% calcium. Still twice as much as Bittman gave his birds. And the result was, at 1% calcium, the shells were 9.3% thinner than the controls. So cutting to 1%, you get 9% thinning of eggshells without any DDT or DDE. And poor Bittman back here using 0.5% should have had 15% thinner shells. Instead, they're only slightly thinner. But he was apparently impressed. He repeated the test. Last thing he did before he left the Fish and Wildlife Service, he carried out another test, same birds, quail, gave him 2.7% calcium in the diet. The result of that test was that both the DDT-fed and the DDE-fed birds produced heavier, thicker eggshells than the controls. Tried to publish it in Science magazine, who had published the other article, but Science refused to publish it. They told Dr. Jukes in a letter that we will not publish anything that is not antagonistic to use of DDT. So they always held up, you've never seen anything in Science like that. So they refused to publish it, and it was published in Poultry Science instead. So anyway, that's the way the stack is, the deck is stacked, I should say. Analysis DDT. Thank you. The analysis using gas chromatograph. I have here a gas chromatogram showing pesticides across the top, PCBs across the middle, and a mixture of both at the bottom. You'll notice a lot of peaks here are exactly the same for PCB as they are for DDT and DDE and chlordine. So when they make an analysis using this method, gas chromatograph, which they usually used, what they call DDT is not necessarily DDT. In fact, a fellow named Scott at Cornell with a lot of colleagues did a lot of work on this, and he points out that in the article 1969 that was most effective in banning DDT by Anderson and Riseborough, they saved the samples and they reanalyzed them in 1969, and the difference between 65 and 69 was in 3 of the 5 samples they had reported having high levels of DDT. Actually, there was none at all. The other 2 had only 1/4 as much as they claimed earlier. But they succeeded in banning DDT anyway, and then finally admitted that analysis is not too good. How about soil samples collected in 1911 and sealed in glass jars, analyzed using gas chromatograph, and shows that it contained 5 kinds of chlorinated hydrocarbon insecticides that did not exist in 1911. And I've always liked Kuhn at Wharf Institute, Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, reported a gibbon collected in Burma in 1935, sealed in a tight container of formalin for 30 years before analysis. Analyses then indicated DDT in the kidneys, liver, and tissue, and brain tissues. even though none existed when the gibbon was alive. So analytical problems are always with us. Most recently, Santa Barbara Basin, I noticed a study talking about how much DDT there was in the sediment. I sent them a copy of the government article. They analyzed 12 different sites, told how much DDT was there. That was about 10 years earlier. But they're blaming this on the Montrose Chemical Company in Los Angeles for polluting the water in the ocean. And, well, I didn't get around to the EPA hearings, but let me get one little bit of cross-examination, which I always thought was interesting. A fellow named Woodwell, well, if I can find it, being cross-examined because of an article he wrote in Science Magazine with Charles Worcester. The article was, the abstract said, I have it here, DDT residues in an extensive salt marsh in the south shore of Long Island average more than 13 pounds per acre. And I give the page number of the transcript for the EPA hearings. Question, isn't it a fact that after you initially studied the marsh, you continued your sampling and found that you were getting an average of about 1 pound per acre instead of 13? Answer, no, I wouldn't agree with that. Then you also find that one of the areas you took your sample was an area that's convenient for the Mosquito Commission spray truck to clean out. I can't say I discovered that either. I don't believe there's any evidence to that effect, said Dr. Woodwell. Did Dr. Worcester, perhaps? That was his co-author. And I'd heard Worcester testify in Seattle about the same thing, so we had it verbatim. But he said, I don't believe he knows that either. I don't think there's any evidence to that effect. Question, Dr. Worcester, your co-author, made the following statement at the Washington State hearings. I'm quoting him verbatim. He testified, quote, we have since sampled the marsh more extensively and we found that the average in the marsh was closer to 1 pound per acre instead of 13. The discrepancy was because our initial sampling was in a convenient place. It turned out to be a convenient place for the Mosquito Commission spray truck too. Did you learn that after the fact, Dr. Woodwell? Answer, that is a true statement in my experience. I didn't know that Dr. Worcester had said that, but that is a true statement. Doctor, have you ever published a retraction of the 13 pounds per acre? Or a further article which discloses the results of your further sampling, which brings the average down to 1 pound per acre? Answer, I never felt this was necessary. He had also written an article in Science Magazine about how much DDT had disappeared from the environment. That was in Science, December 1971. 6 billion pounds have been used, but only 12 million pounds can be accounted for in all the Earth's biota. He said that's less than a 30th of 1 year's production of DDT. He theorized most of the DDT has either been degraded to innocuousness or sequestered in places where it's not freely available. A reporter for Business Week magazine said, why didn't you mention that in the EPA hearings? And he said, well, I was going to, the EPA lawyers told me not to mention it lest my testimony be disallowed. So that's what we're up against. And I'm sure I'm out of time. Thank you very much, and hope I see you all. If you have any other questions, let me know.